I'm very pleased to be here for this masterclass in our series this evening. And tonight it's me. Here we are, March 8th at the U Club. But don't forget to come back on March 22nd for the final masterclass of our series featuring Dr. Harper. So in the first masterclass, if you were here, you heard about why it is that people tend to struggle with science. And I drew a lot of the ideas from my book with Dr. Barbara Hofer, Science Denial, Why It Happens, and What to Do About It. And if you were here, you remember that we talked about 5 factors: social identity, mental shortcuts, epistemic cognition, motivated reasoning, and emotions and attitudes. But the second half of the book, that's the why it happens part. The second half is what to do about it. So tonight, we're going to move to some ideas about how to address science doubt, denial, and resistance. So just to briefly run through an overview of the areas in the book that we cover on things that you can do as individuals, as educators, as communicators and policymakers. And then I'm going to turn to some things that educators can do in depth based on research projects that I've been engaged in. All right, so what can individuals do? It's important to cultivate a scientific attitude and nurture an appreciation of science in others. It's important to improve your search skills when you seek information about scientific claims and sources online. This one we're going to delve deep into this evening. Be aware of cognitive biases and motivations in your own reasoning. Learn to listen to others with curiosity, compassion, and openness. And we support vigorously voting, and that's a form of civic engagement, voting for those who support, value, and fund science and make decisions based on science. What can educators do? All educators should enhance our own understanding of science, whether we're teaching science directly or not. If you are teaching science, it's important to teach about the nature of science. So the nature of science is, how do scientists know what they know, and how do they understand what they understand, and what don't they know and why don't they know it? We must foster scientific thinking in all students, not just those who are pursuing STEM careers, but scientific thinking is useful in our day-to-day life, and so all students should have the basics of scientific reasoning. We should teach real-world applications of science. So I'll go in depth in one of our projects tonight that does that. Let students choose their own areas of scientific inquiry. I'll give an example tonight of that. Always be aware of the strong beliefs, attitudes, and identities in your classroom, because that impacts how students, the lens through which students understand science. And recognize students' emotions, because scientific topics are often laden with a lot of emotional content. Finally, you want to foster digital literacy, because most of what students learn about science these days they get off the internet, and that's even true if they're learning about it in the classroom. So tonight I'm going to go deep into a couple of these areas, and digital scientific literacy is one of them. All right, so addressing science denial. I want to start with a long program of my research I've been doing for probably 20 years or more, and that is directly confronting misinformation and misconceptions. Then I'm going to go into a current grant that I have on sourcing scientific information online and how to teach students to do that. And then I'm going to give an example of making science relevant, place-based, and engaging. And I'm going to draw heavily there on my work at the La Brea Tar Pits. All right, so first, confronting misconceptions and misinformation. So I strongly encourage people to download the debunking handbook. So the QR code is the debunking handbook. If you're interested in debunking, you should click on that. So the debunking handbook was put together by a group of psychologists. I was part of this team, but there's probably 30 people involved. And what they do in the debunking handbook is provide research-based approaches to debunking misinformation. So the thing to remember is that misinformation is sticky. Once you have it, it's hard to get rid of. And so one thing they recommend is to try and prevent misinformation from being out there in the first place. So we'll talk about one strategy you can do that. But it's important to remember you can debunk misinformation. A lot of people say you can't. Yes, you can. I've got a lot of research to support that, and the debunking handbook gives you all sorts of strategies. A very important thing with debunking, though, is to explain why the misinformation is false. Nobody changes their mind after you tell them they're wrong. That's not how that works. So you have to do what's called a fact sandwich, some people say, which is present facts or warn about a myth, explain that myth, and then make sure you go with reinforcing the facts at the end. I've spent the majority of my research in this area on a particular debunking strategy called refutations. So you can refute misconceptions about science if you use this particular strategy, this refutational strategy. And it has 3 parts, and it's extremely important you use all 3 parts. First, you state the misconception. Second, you refute the misconception. And then third, and this is probably the most important, you explain the scientifically valid position. Again, you just don't tell people you're mistaken because that doesn't work. People you should provide for them, and they need to have the correct scientifically valid explanation. So on the right, you see this example that we've used. You may think that genetically modified foods is the same thing as the process of cloning. This is not correct. Cloning involves making an exact genetic copy of an organism, and then the text goes on to explain exactly what genetically modifying an organism does. So we use these in text primarily. They can be used in discussions. They can be used in groups. They can be used individually. They can be used online. And we've seen in quite a bit of research that refutational text can shift attitudes, emotions, and knowledge as well as knowledge, while at the same time debunking the misconception. This particular study we did on genetically modified foods, but we've used this strategy in a variety of topics around science. Other people have used it for vaccinations and other misinformation that's out there. Currently, we have in submission with my colleagues Erica Patel here at USC Rossier and Robert Danielson and his colleagues at Washington State, a meta-analysis looking at several hundred studies that have used this technique, and spoiler alert, it really does work. But as I said, misinformation is sticky, so another strategy is to try and not get people to accept that misinformation in the first place. And this strategy is called pre-bunking. So the idea behind pre-bunking is you stop misinformation before it starts by exposing people to a severely weakened dose of the misinformation. And if you're sensing a metaphor there is one. It's an inoculation metaphor. So you preemptively create cognitive antibodies in an attempt to inoculate the message recipient. So all this is, hey, you may hear in the next few weeks that masks cause language delays in young children. That was actually a myth that was going around when masks were first being used for COVID. This is not correct. Then you go on to explain the true scientific information. So pre-bunking includes a sort of forewarning plus a refutation. So the difference between the two strategies is refutation, the misconception's already out there, and pre-bunking, you're trying to get out in front of it before it happens. Now, another important aspect of pre-bunking is they often, in this strategy, they use some instruction to also explain standard misinformation techniques. A classic misinformation technique is cherry-picking data. That's just picking out the data that support your point of view. And so that is usually included in these pre-bunks, is they'll say, you know, the reason this isn't correct is because this data has been cherry-picked, and they explain that. So anyway, if you're interested in this whole host of different strategies you can use to confront misconceptions, the Debunking Handbook is great. This recent article in Nature goes over the research. The Debunking Handbook gives you the how-to. This article gives you all the research behind the different strategies and how they work. Now, when I talk about refuting or debunking misconceptions, people always say, oh, you can't do that, it backfires. So what's the backfire effect? The backfire effect is the ironic strengthening or intensification of an original belief in a misconception or misinformation that is the subject of an attempted correction. So basically, it's doubling down on something that you believe but is incorrect, and someone tries to correct that notion. The research has shown that on balance, it's really still worth trying to debunk misinformation because backfire effects are pretty minimal. And in some cases, if you're talking about the risks of avoiding vaccination because you think that it's going to cause infertility, for example, that was a misconception that was floated around, it's important to go ahead and debunk. So don't be afraid of backfire effects is the bottom line on that one. All right, so to sum up this first part of how to confront misinformation, you can pre-bunk, you can debunk, and you can refute. Another important aspect of correcting misinformation is to reduce uncertainty, because one of the strategies people use in presenting misinformation is to make the scientific information seem much more uncertain than it is. So you'll hear, oh, we don't know if the vaccines are safe because not enough people have taken them. They've been given to billions of people at this point, so that's just not true. So reduce uncertainty. Creating personal relevance is really key. People are much more receptive to information if it's personally relevant and they need it in the moment. Connecting to current issues is very important, so if it's important to them in the moment, and if it connects to something that's happening, much more likely to be successful. It's important to trigger positive emotions and to reduce negative emotions, and we have found that debunking with refutations can do that, so that's why it's one of our favorite strategies. Finally, we have found that empowering action at the end of all this strategy is also really, really helpful, reduces anxiety around the topic. All right, so that's the first step that one can take, and that is confront misconceptions. Don't let them hang out there. There's different techniques you can use, and they are effective. But where do people get, and this is students, adults, everybody, where do people get their scientific information? They get it online. So this is true if you want to find out about vaccine safety, you go online. This is true if a student asks a teacher, you know, were dinosaurs and humans on the earth at the same time? The teacher might say, well, Google it, right? Thinking that this is a great strategy. But is it? Well, online sources of scientific information can be incredibly difficult to evaluate. It can be difficult to evaluate if they're valid, if they're accurate, or if they're biased. and they might be not valid, inaccurate, and biased. So what we've developed with my colleagues, Doug Lombardi and graduate student here in Rossier, Imogen Herrick, is 6 steps to sourcing scientific information online. And this was an article that was just published, and I did mention it in the first talk, but this time I'm actually going to go through the 6 steps. And this was published in the Science Teacher, so we put this out there for teachers to use in their classrooms. Step 1, don't just click and share. So stop, step back, and read the article. You might have noticed before the current owner took over Twitter that when you went to share an article on Twitter, it would, if you hadn't read the article, it would ask you, would you like to read the article first? That was a really good strategy taken from this research. Unfortunately, I don't think they're doing that anymore, but that was a very productive strategy, and I advise you to do it. One reason, of course, is because we know quite well that headlines, clickbait headlines, do not necessarily reflect even what's in the article. So often the headline is actually the opposite of what's in the article. So the headline is definitely different than what's in the article. So stop, step back, and actually read the article before you share. Now, the next step is you've got to ask yourself, is this information trustworthy, and how do I know? Well, of course, you've got to scan the article, but is that enough? No. So what you have to do is become your own fact checker. So how do you do that? Well, this is basically information literacy that we need to teach to all of our students. And back in the day, we used to say, oh, just check the source. Well, that is just not easy to do anymore. So the strategy we're now exploring in this NSF grant I have with the University of Maryland is something called lateral reading. So when you go to check a source, what do? You open a new window. So then you want to go do a little research on the article, on the author's the author of the article, and you want to ask yourself, is this person truly an expert? Are they reputable, trustworthy, objective, politically motivated? Are they trying to sell something? We've done this with kids in middle school, and it sounds like it's hard to do, but you'd be surprised how good kids are at trying to figure out this last one. Are they trying to sell you something? They all get that one. They know right away. Oh, wait a minute, they're trying to sell me something. So you want to read laterally, not vertically. Well, what does that mean? Well, hopefully I'm going to be able to show you.
How are you taught to evaluate the credibility of online sources? Everyone knows that information on the web may be shallow, incomplete, inaccurate, or heavily biased, and many of us have been taught to explore the features of a website to assess its credibility. You may have learned to ask, is this site a .com or a .org? Does the site incorporate advertisements? Was it written by someone who appears to have appropriate expertise? Are there citations to supporting evidence or research? Is the information current? While sometimes useful, these questions can also misdirect you because they rely on superficial markers of credibility and authority. For example, some .org websites may be reliable and nonpartisan, while others may be partisan political action groups or even promoters of widely debunked conspiracy theories. On the other hand, some of the most authoritative news websites are .coms with advertisements, such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Relying on superficial markers to evaluate credibility can be problematic because most websites won't say, I was designed by a biased political organization with an intent to manipulate you, or I'm leaving out important information that might give you a more objective perspective on this issue, or I was written by an uninformed person with no relevant expertise. So how do we improve our ability to evaluate websites when we know that some individuals and organizations may be working hard to misrepresent themselves and misinform us? By using a skill called lateral reading. Lateral reading is a simple concept used by professional fact-checkers and other savvy thinkers to judge the credibility of unfamiliar sources. While many of us judge a website by reading vertically, scrolling up and down to look for markers of credibility, or perhaps clicking on links within the site, fact checkers jump outside the site, using new browser tabs to seek additional information about the site's credibility, reputation, funding sources, and potential biases. In other words, fact checkers read laterally or horizontally across multiple web pages to get a big picture view of the site they're evaluating. They use Wikipedia, credible news sources, and other references on the web to understand what a source is and how credible it might be. They don't just take the source's word for it. For example, this news story on heavy metal music fan culture is on phys.org, a website that may be unfamiliar to us. But if I open up a new tab, I can search for information about phys.org and find out that it's a news aggregator that often republishes science news from across the web. I can also verify that the research discussed in the news story originated from University College London and PhD anthropology student Lindsay Bishop. By doing some homework on the source through lateral reading, we get a much better sense of what this source is and its level of credibility. We can also begin to think about its strengths and limitations from a more informed point of view. In this case, we might decide the information is reliable and a good starting point. But we might also want to look beyond this brief news story and find the original research or other more in-depth scholarly information. With lateral reading, you can move beyond the superficial aspects of website evaluation and develop a more nuanced and more complete perspective on the credibility of your sources.
So as you can see, let's see if we can get out of this. As you can see, lateral reading is a pretty easy, way for students to become fact checkers. So what we are doing in this current grant is we are incorporating lateral reading strategies into our traditional strategy that we developed about evaluating scientific information and claims that students find online. So we're going to couple evaluation of the information with evaluation of the source. So how do we evaluate the information we've found? Well, we always check to see if the evidence supports the claim, and then we have to consider alternative claims. And then you evaluate both the original and the alternative claim to decide which has more support. And if you were in my first lecture, I went through a model evidence link diagram activity that we do with middle schoolers that teach them how to do that. So this current grant will incorporate that evaluation with the lateral reading that you just saw. Now, it's important to keep in mind in the middle of all of this, something also from the first lecture, which is motivated reasoning. So as you're doing this, you have to sort of reflect on your own motivations and know that your own motivations can bias your understanding, and they can lead us to make bad decisions, and we can be more critical of information when we don't like the findings. And so as we are evaluating the information, we have to ask ourselves, what are my motivations for assuming this information is correct or true? Next step. You have to evaluate the plausibility of the information. So we engage students in something called plausibility judgments. We ask them, is the original claim plausible? And if not, you have to reevaluate that information and shift your plausibility judgment if necessary. Next, you then share information after you've verified the information and the source. And it's great to contextualize the information so they understand where it comes from. So this sounds like a ton of steps you could never, do quickly, but what we find once we teach students to do these steps, they become pretty automatic, and you can, you're not going to go to this step from every article you find online, but if you're trying to find an important piece of information about whether vaccines cause autism or cause infertility, or if dinosaurs were on the earth at the same time as humans, it is worth going through these steps, and we find students can do them. They can do them effectively and reliably, and once they learn to do them, they become a little bit more automated, and can actually be done in a couple of minutes altogether. All right, so skipping on, that's just reevaluating your plausibility judgment one more time. I just don't want to run out of time, but you can go back through it twice. I do want to get through to the final part of my talk tonight, and that is, what can educators do to make science more relevant, more place-based, and more engaging? So last time I mentioned that in a previous project a few years ago, in collaboration with my colleagues here at Rossier, we made science learning more engaging through incorporating play. And we did this through the use of a curriculum we developed called Speedometry, where we used Hot Wheels, cars, and tracks to engage students in scientific inquiry around topics of their own choosing. So play is a very easy way to engage students and make science learning much more fun. But what about making it place-based? So that brings me to the last project that I wanted to share with you tonight, and that is my work I've been doing for the last 4 years out at La Brea Tar Pits. So if you've never been out to La Brea, you really need to go. It's a very, very interesting place. But the difficulty with visiting La Brea is it's really hard from walking the grounds to figure out what the heck went on there. So it's really just a bunch of grass and some pits of tar, and you're like, okay, cool. So it's really hard to understand what it is you're really seeing there. So that brings us to the project TAR AR, is what we call it, bringing the past to life in place-based augmented reality science learning. So what we're doing out there is we're building 2 augmented reality exhibits, and this is a collaboration between me, La Brea Tar Pits, Dr. Emily Lindsay, also she works for the Natural History Museum as well, and from our colleagues, Bill Swartout and Ben Nye over at USC Institute for Creative Technologies. So there already is some AR exhibits at La Brea, and all museums are beginning to use AR because AR is really great for visualizing information that you otherwise really can't easily access. So they already have a couple of AR exhibits, and we're building 2 new ones. The research on our 2 conditions, our 2 experiences, we have a couple of different conditions. So in order to do this research, we have a sign that we've created that shares the same information that we share through the augmented reality. And the sign is installed now permanently at La Brea in concrete, so it's not going anywhere. We're pretty excited about that. So we compare people's viewing of the sign and the information they glean from the sign, which is a typical way to get museum information, to 2 different conditions of AR and 2 different interactivity levels. So the 2 different conditions are a handheld device, so in other words, you can see the whole experience on your phone, a headset device, and this is sort of like your Oculus kind of thing where you watch it through a headset, and then the 2 interactivity conditions manipulate how highly interactive it is between you and the AR conditions. So this is the first condition. I know some of you, I think a couple of you in the room came out and tried it. This is the first condition. It's called Pit 91. At Pit 91, visitors come in and they dig virtually for fossils in a tar pit. And they find those fossils and they then send them to a lab virtually and identify those fossils. The second experience we're building is called the field experience, and this one is literally out in the field. And in this field, they can look, again, using either the headset or with the, just their phones, and be immersed with the Ice Age animals of La Brea who come to life and walk around them. So this was really fun data collection because we had to follow people around because we were afraid they were going to fall because they got so engrossed. I actually had to grab a guy that was going to fall into a tar pit. It was pretty exciting because they get so engrossed they kind of lose their surroundings. So note to the museums, make sure you keep people in an enclosed space because you don't know where they're going to go. So over the two experiences, this is data from the field, but the data is the same. Over the two experiences, compared pre to post, we have found very significant learning gains over our conditions. And if you break it out by condition, and this is really interesting for museum educators, what we find is the low interactivity phone handheld condition is the best, which is not what we expected. We expected the high interactivity to be the best. This data is for knowledge gain. We're still analyzing the data. We were doing that today. We're still analyzing the data for emotions and motivations, and so the engagement data may reveal a slightly different story for the more immersive headset conditions. But in terms of learning, which is what I'm most concerned about, the handheld devices is fine. So that's a really great thing because it's more affordable and easier for museums to enact on site. All right, so now I'm going to show you a 5-minute film that they made about our project.
When visitors come to La Brea Tar Pits, they may not understand what they're going to see, or they may even have some misconceptions about what they'll find here. We really wanted to address those misconceptions. We think that augmented reality gives teachers a tool to use in their classroom, or museum educators a tool to use in informal learning environments. What AR and VR, virtual reality, can do is it can take the student to places that they can't go on their own, maybe to the surface of the moon or under the ocean. What we were able to do here at La Brea Tar Pits was take them into the past.
We really believe in teaching from our exhibits here. We know how important this site is. It's one of the only places you can see the scientific process of excavation from start to finish in one place. That's super special. So we want to make sure students and teachers understand where they are and what they're looking at and what they're experiencing. So we really try to teach directly from the exhibits here. What's really exciting about this experience that we've developed is that students of all ages are going to be able to see Ice Age Los Angeles come to life. They're going to understand how these fossils can teach us not only about the past, what these animals used to be like, they can even teach us about the future.
I want people to get the feeling that the science that was collected here at the fossils in the ground come right up into the experience that they're seeing in front of them when they look through the augmented reality. They have that connection.
When we have had people try the augmented reality experience here at La Brea Tar Pits, what we've noticed is it's very engrossing and very immersive. So sometimes when you walk through a museum, you may stop at an exhibit for 30 seconds or a minute. We've had people run through our augmented reality exhibit for 10, 15 minutes, and then they ask us if there's any more.
There's something really magical about being able to see what these Ice Age animals would have looked like walking around, and something they really can't get without an experience like this. So TAR AR is really going to bring Ice Age Los Angeles to life for learning communities in a way that we can't currently do without it.
The most exciting thing about this project to me is about the collaboration that we have between basically people who work on technology, people who work on educational practices, and paleontologists. I think kind of that connection of everyone working together on this makes us really exciting. Like every day when we come in, there's a new idea and we're sharing a lot of knowledge back and forth.
We chose to use augmented reality rather than virtual reality here because augmented reality allows you to be in the scene. And one of the unique things about this site, about the La Brea Tar Pit site, is that you've got a museum that is right next to the actual source of all the material that they exhibit. So we want people to be immersed in that.
Every single one of our AR animals is actually built off of one of the skeletons right here in the museum. We took a lot of images of all of the skeletons, compiled that with a huge amount of research that has been done both here at the tar pits and research that has been done elsewhere by other researchers on what these creatures ate, how they moved, what they probably looked like, what their coloring was probably like. And we combined all of this research to make the best possible sort of paleoartistic representations that we could, given the limitations of making low poly animals.
A problem with conventional paleo art is that everybody expects it to look photoreal. And that means specifying things like the hair and the texture and so forth. But we often don't know that information from the fossil record. And so the artist just has to guess. With using low poly images, we can be more abstract. We don't have to specify that.
You learn something just by seeing the animals and seeing how they move, seeing how they walk, seeing how they interact with each other.
We are really excited to use TAR AR as well as our fossil collection to help students build critical thinking skills and inference making skills that are really sometimes challenging to get to in the classroom with this primary source material that we have that we're excavating right here every day.
With the next generation science standards, we're really trying to push science instruction into the scientific process. How do scientists actually do science? And so augmented reality can really help kids utilize the science and engineering practices in ways where they can develop models based upon virtual objects they might see and processes that they may have not been able to see in other circumstances.
We want to be able to help children get excited about science and learn things about science and paleontology, but we also want adults and people at all phases of life to be able to learn more about this. That's one of the things that getting it out there to a lot of people to understand what science is about and how it comes from just looking at the evidence that in this case is right in the ground, picking up and being able to analyze in the right way to be able to understand things about the past and sometimes more.
I really see augmented reality as an additional part of a teacher's toolkit. I see it as a way for teachers to really spark curiosity and interest in science that's happening in front of students because it's able to help students see things that they might not always be able to see with their naked eye.
So if you're interested in having a saber-toothed cat, a direwolf, or a ground sloth play with your dog, you can do that. You can get our little animals to run around your room if you use Snapchat. I can't tell you that I know exactly how that works, but apparently a lot of people do. All right, so if you don't get those right now, contact me because we have a lot of these filters, and La Brea has put them all up. All over the museum. So bottom line, my recommendations are to teach science in a place-based, engaging, and motivating way in the first place. Teach students how to source and evaluate scientific information they have online, and then actively confront misconceptions and misinformation with effective techniques. Thank you. And I'll take questions. Yuhanya.
Do you think that for the results that you got, they have to be at the locations, or can it just happen in a classroom?
So that's an awesome question. And during COVID, our project was shut down for a year and a half. And while it was shut down because the museum was shut down, we started working on the idea of a remote AR experience, and we totally believe that that is possible. One of the things we want to do, and we've submitted a grant on this, which we didn't get, and we're going to resubmit it. One of the things we don't know in answer to your question is the place-based part. So one of the beautiful things about being on that field at La Brea and seeing the skyscraper and then seeing the mammoth walk in front of you is to realize what Los Angeles looked like during the Ice Age, and that juxtaposition when you're right there is so powerful. We don't know, and that's why we'd like to research it. Can you replicate that online? But the other thing about place-based is there's something special about it being your place, right? You know, it's in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, and you know, if you're doing this in Minnesota, we would assume that you would want to look at, you know, local, like a moose rather than a dire wolf, you know, something that's place-based there, right? So that's another question is, can you do it remote, but should place-based really be in the place that you are for the best motivation and engagement? Oh, yeah, we need to use the microphone because we have people online who can't hear the question unless you use the mic. Thank you.
Dr. Sinatra, I'd like to express my appreciation for the wonderful presentation today and all the interesting thoughts that you've done and that I've just been privy to being engaged with today. How do you, the child that we were talking about, we know prior to 7, after 7, in your interaction with them or as a follow-up initiative, have you discussed the transition or their thinking, comparing the 7-year-old with the 12, and were you able to do that in your research project?
We have actually, I'm glad Eugenia is here because Eugenia actually did that in our speedometry project. So the speedometry project, which was the play-based with cars and tracks, we had developed it for 4th grade, and Eugenia took it and did it with kindergartners. So she's in a better position to answer that question than I am. But in the interest of time, I think I would just say that it was effective in the younger groups. And myself and people that I've worked with, we've worked from kindergarten through graduate students and members of the public. So we've worked in all different age groups in teaching science, critical thinking, reasoning, all these topics. They can be done appropriately in the right developmental context, depending, of course, on that context. And so one of the things that we'd like to do is take the TAR AR project and move it to middle school, because right now it's really a sort of more almost an adult-oriented experience, and we want to move it to middle schoolers and after-school programs, because La Brea has literally millions of visitors from middle schools. And we think we can also change it to, rather than an individual experience, a social experience. So we want to build a age-appropriate social AR experience around this content. Yes.
Thank you again for the presentation. Can this be replicated with all the other museums around the world, science-oriented, to get more students and, faculty and everything engaged much more than they've ever been, and maybe also reach out to special needs kids that may be out of the box, that literally, I think, would be enamored by this and get motivated and
Yeah, absolutely. So as science has been under attack in education in K-12 settings and formal schooling, informal science learning centers have really taken over, in particular museums. Museums have been doing incredible work in science education the last few years, but then it just exploded during COVID. When people couldn't go anywhere, museums put a lot of their content online that wasn't online before, and this did make it accessible to people at home, people with disabilities who couldn't go to the actual sites, and so it was revolutionary. And then, as Eugenia was saying, can you do some of this AR online? And we think that you can. I mean, we think you can, like, use these QR codes, take a picture, get a dire wolf to walk around your living room while you're interacting with people who are at La Brea, and maybe you're in Chicago. That is kind of the plan for the next iteration of the work. And as you mentioned, this would make it accessible to people with disabilities as well. And museums are doing this everywhere. It is exploding, and like I said, COVID really pushed it to the next level and made it much more broadly adopted than it had been previously.
Thank you again for the presentation. And I'll say, the ability for VR to make things accessible is great, but I think you're right. Enhancing that museum experience is really important and adds a different dimension to it. So my one question is, have you looked at like gamification as one of those kind of tools to kind of provide a motivation for kids to engage in all of the content at a museum?
Yeah, absolutely. The social AR that we're trying to build is built on a game-based model. So absolutely, there's so much gaming related to science learning, and of course that can be inherently engaging and motivating in and of itself. So we're trying to build this social AR with a game-based model. So like you'd play, this game together. And one of the things we've been struggling to figure out is the point that you hit on immediately. Like if you had 2 players at La Brea, could you be playing with somebody who was off-site? Like, and could you all be playing together at the same time? You can do that, as you know, with other games, right? So that's kind of the next frontier, and that would be super cool. We hope we can do that. Any questions from online? The dean is asking. We'll come back to you, Henya, and then over here.
I was going back to when you were talking about pre-bunking and debunking and refuting, and then the process for credibility of sources. I mean, love the practical piece of it that we can share with students. Have you had a chance to work with other disciplines on this work? Because it's similar to the way we might think about looking at history, or being more integrated in ELA in the way that we teach kids about being critical literacy.
Absolutely. So lateral reading was developed by my grant partner, Sarah McGrew, and Sam Weinberg at Stanford. And they did it for history. So that's where it comes from. It's the fact-checking technique that historians and journalists use to fact-check. So they're the ones that originally brought it in to and adapted it to social studies education. So now what we're doing in the next iteration is Sarah has joined our team, Doug Lombardi at University of Maryland, Sarah who's now at Maryland, and myself, and we're collaborating to put it together with the source evaluation and the plausibility judgments that we teach students to do now. We've had a few grants on that. With this technique that was originally developed from a social studies stance. And it goes across anything, right? Because it's a critical thinking strategy. And you could extend it to what we're dealing with right now, with election denialism. How do you find out if was there voter fraud? How do you know that? Like that's a difficult thing to figure out if you just Google it, because depending on what kinds of websites you visit, you'll find very different and conflicting information. So this can be used, this technique of lateral reading and source evaluation and critical evaluation of information can be used across all sorts of different domains. Yes, and then come back over.
Thank you for the presentation. Is it on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I've got a question. How valuable do you say Google Scholar is?
So Google Scholar is better than Google because Google Scholar is in fact vetted by library systems. So it does have better sourcing. So I would definitely recommend Google Scholar over Google. Depending on what it is that you're looking for, not for a restaurant recommendation, it's not going to help you there. But if you're looking for scientific information or journal articles, then Google Scholar is absolutely much better than Google. Both are, I mean, we're seeing, right, with ChatGPT, once you scrape the internet, you get everything, everything comes up. So, we're going to see that with ChatGPT. That ChatGPT it just scrapes the internet, so it scrapes everything that's out there, the good stuff, the bad stuff, the misinformation, and that's going to be really difficult as moving forward with these generative AI programs. Is that they're going to have inherent problems like bias and racism and misconceptions and misinformation is just going to be rampant, and there's no human there, right? So. There's no content moderator, there's no human. So that's going to be a real challenge in teaching students about ChatGPT and how to use it effectively. We had a question back over here.
Thank you again. I'm thinking through strengths and limitations, as well as the other question, how do you know what you're really seeing? Now, I work with children with disabilities and elevated skills, and when I find that the child has that joint attention, interested, perhaps merge to the interest areas and bring the child in more and more to the conversation. And also they reveal certain things about themselves that perhaps they haven't talked about. Next week, we'll be talking about that. But I think what you're doing is looking at something from the outside, inside, and inside, outside. It's not just a one-path event. It's a dual situation. And I think more if we can think of thinking and interacting with people as if it's social relations that we're talking about, I think that we will break through the threshold that we now are hindered by in terms of our emotional thinking. Your program and what the University of Southern California is doing is really doing just that. It's breaking that threshold, and it's making it known to the people that are interested and want to know. And I think that all of what you've incorporated just in today's lesson is really commendable, because you're dealing with complex information, but you're also setting it up in a cognitive situation where people can deal with it and not be afraid of information. And I commend you for that.
Thank you.
I commend USC for doing what it's doing as well.
Thank you. All science is constructed and learned in a social interaction. Science is constructed by humans for good and for also the foibles. We bring our foibles into science and our biases into science. But the more we can be inclusive in science, the more we can, over time, correct those challenges. But science is also taught and learned in that social setting. And so we have to consider how the social interaction empowers that. So that's a very important point about the social nature of science itself and the social nature of science teaching and learning. And we hope to explore a lot of that in our new STEAM Center that we are trying to initiate here at USC Ross here.
We did get 2 more questions online. The first one is, do you have any specific advice for beginning science teachers who may already be overwhelmed?
I'm sure science teachers are overwhelmed, and I'm sure all teachers are overwhelmed. There's so much pushback for teachers right now in all areas, but particularly in science, with so many hot button topics that they are having to deal with, just thinking about COVID and all these different things that they've had to deal with in terms of mis and disinformation. What I would say is there is a ton of really good resources out there for teaching science. It's incredible. And those resources are all free. So there's things like the Understanding Evolution website at Berkeley that has all these resources for teaching evolution. There are simulations, free simulations. The Concord Consortium has simulations to teach about genetics. And they're very interactive, and kids get to pose questions and then run sims, and it's all free. So I could go on and on and on, but there are tremendous resources out there for teaching science that really are engaging and interactive. You don't have to construct the wheel. Our speedometry is available online. And so you don't have to construct the wheel yourself. There's a ton of information out there that's really, really fabulous.
Okay, great, thanks. And the second question is, how are Indigenous perspectives being included in the AR experiences at La Brea?
That's something that we've thought about quite a bit. We are sensitive to that. There's a human remain at La Brea, so that is something that we've been extremely sensitive to avoid. So we are aware of those issues, and we have been thinking about them, but it's important to bring them up and to consider what we can do to be even more respectful of that environment. And it's something to be deeply concerned about, so thanks for raising that issue. I have time for one more question. Yes.
Usually I never talk at these things. It's unusual. I was thinking about science fairs. Every school, elementary, middle school, and Ed being principal, for many years, I always attended, of reaching out to maybe the science teachers and maybe some of these experiments and some of these projects you've been doing, maybe get the word out all over. You can start here in Southern California, both the public and private schools that may not know of all these resources.
I'm pretty sure our Fred Frecking, actually, who's a science educator here at Rossier, does engage with science fairs. Science fairs can be great. They can also not be great. They have to be done well. They have to be inclusive. They can't be overly, competitive. They have to be about the science. So they have to be done well. But when they are done well, they're awesome. So it can be great. And I appreciate that. We also look at a lot after-school programming, because after-school programs, there's a lot of robotics, there's all sorts of things going on. Programming, coding is huge. So there's all sorts of things going on with STEM initiatives in after-school programming as well. All right, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Drive safely.